I think that you can still keep the nuance. You can still keep a party that is looking out for you're tired, you're hungry, you're poor. But we have to just get at this. How does the party stand for basic needs? And the Republican Party is very good at just talking about, you want economic security, you want energy security, you want freedom from government intervention, and you want to make sure that you've got a healthy retirement and a good paying job. Then like, we're the party for
But
you. And I don't think
but
that's ground we have to cede. I forgot what the year was, maybe 2020, post pandemic, or like as we were pulling ourselves out of the pandemic, 2021, I think. I got off Instagram and Facebook.
Same,
Not for
similar.
any, like, I don't have like a deep philosophy around it, just like circumstances popped up where, like, I think I was being trolled on one account, and I was just like, okay, I'm just going to temporarily like shut this down for a second. And then I haven't been on since, which I feel like is net healthy given a lot of the dialogue in the world. But I feel like I miss so much content. I need people to, if Arjun sends me a viral clip of him on Instagram, I need him to screen record it like a geriatric man, just to be watch it.
I've said this about Arvind too. This is something that I've been wanting to express to him, but Arvind is like one of the smartest people in the universe, knows everything, very scientific, but purposefully a Luddite on a lot of things. Like,
Interesting.
yeah, like doesn't want to be on his phone all the time, doesn't want to be like super Instagram scroll, doom scroll, whatever. And it's a fun contrast because he's like, you're such a technical like person, but you just like, there's certain things where, like the other day we're on a pod with Karthik Ramakrishnan, this VC, and he's like, "What is Discord? Like, I've never. What is that all about?" And I'm like, "Dude, how do you not know what Discord is? Like, this is ridiculous."
I'm a man of the people, dude. I'm like this. I'm representing our 65 plus population on the pod who doesn't know what this shit is. Actually, honestly, like when I look at what we're doing on the pod, part of me is like, I'm so happy it's forcing me to be exposed to these thoughts about, okay, well, how do you do something on Instagram, or like, what do you do on X? Because I've always had this feeling like, oh my God, I'm like missing out on all this stuff, like you were saying, Vikram. And then I'm like, man, I don't have enough motivation to do it, to get into it enough.
Yeah.
And I like, this is actually forcing me to contemplate or to look into that.
You have like sort of a mental health, like maybe it's not mental health, but some health reason to not do it too, right? Because you don't want to be too screen heavy and or something like. There's something.
It's definitely, yeah. I mean, honestly, it's like I never felt authentic about it. To be honest, like it always felt like I was it was like a gaining idea to me to try to get, like, let's say LinkedIn. It always felt very like I could never get it to feel non-selfish.
Yeah.
And so then that feeling made me just disconnect from it.
Yeah.
And that felt true for me for other platforms too.
Here's a hypothesis. I don't know if it's true for both of you, but I think also there's like, however you were motivated in life, whether it was like a little bit of nature, a little bit of nurture, of like the homes that you grew up in, the schools you went to, et cetera, et cetera. Once you kind of broke the life of independence post undergrad, just as like a random marker in time, whatever you did to achieve, however you define that, right? Like with a fulfilling family, a fulfilling job, maybe your job has an exit, et cetera, like you did based off of the tools and the arrows you had in your quiver. And you're like, oh, this is how one propels themselves forward in life. So to like layer on like a new tool that like A, feels inauthentic, and B, doesn't feel like it's necessary to like keep your forward momentum, it's like another reason to stand down. But then I was when Vic was mentioning Madhulika and like taking to Instagram to like talk about disaster response, disaster preparedness and relief, it reminded me of like, she is using modern tools. And she's only a few years younger than us, right? So it's not like she was infinitely more digitally native than we were, but using modern tools. And that's probably going to like only up her brand. And like, I'm like, I've never needed to do that, I think, in my domain, but like a tip of the hat to her. And it's also like when AOC post-Trump election got Instagram Live going, I think it was Instagram Live, some live feedback moment. And she was like, if you voted for me and you voted for him, like, I want to hear from you. Like,
Hmm.
what's going on the disconnect, and like, what did we miss? What are we missing as a Democratic Party? And I do respect people, to your point, that like use those tools because they're massive unlocks, but it's very easy to just coast through life to be like, well, I've been able to achieve a couple of things and move forward for myself or my community without them. So it's easier just
So one thing like I always felt for you specifically was you have always been super polished to me, like super um I don't know, just put together. Like it feels like ever since I've known you, you've just had that about you. And I feel like was that something for you that came when you started entering policy in the beginning, like coming out of college, you knew you wanted to be in the policy world? Was it, hey, I this is the part and I need to fit the part, or was it just like something for you that's always been inherent and just natural, comes across naturally?
that's a good question. I imagine some of it was um cosplay a little bit, right? Like early on, I think all of us, Arvind, I know you were in it for sure. Vivek, maybe you too. I don't know if they had it in your high school in LA, but doing speech and debate in high
Mm.
school, like I just was inherently attracted. I had a magnetism towards it, and that you're putting on a tie, you're like presenting an argument, and so just like the polish that you needed to like compete in that domain, I think was something that I liked, and then like you want to set yourself up for success by like sort of projecting and visualizing that you can do it, right? So that sort of adds the flywheel of wanting to be polished. And then maybe in college or my first job in Washington, D.C., where I was working for a congressman named Ed Markey, who's now a senator. Um, the kind of you look around you and you're like, whoa, right? Like what felt like play because you read about it in books in Berkeley poli sci classes, or you saw episodes about working in Congress on the West Wing. It felt very real, and like if you revere people in those spaces, you sort of want to follow that trajectory, and that could be polished by way of the way you communicate, and you're like, wow, that's a really good speaker, I want to be like them one day, or the way they write, or the way they pursue change, or the way they dress. But I will say, while I appreciate you saying that, I don't know if this is too honest and too vulnerable, because this is not really like maybe the focus of this podcast, but I also feel like being polished has worked against me in a lot of ways as I grapple with sort of like inner truths as I grow up. Um, having uh, having a family and having a child in a like unconventional order of operations in life, like, and particularly being nervous about how to communicate that to myself and own that and show up and be responsible for that, and then also kind of tripping about how it might be perceived by others in our community, which has nothing to do with work, it has nothing to do with policy, but it was a polish that I couldn't control, if you will. It was a narrative that I couldn't control, and once that truth was named out loud, perhaps scandalous to some, perhaps, challenging to others, or in the way that my parents received it, very like, wow, there's a grandkid in our life. Like that, I think, was the time I realized that like indexing too much on like how you appear on LinkedIn or how you appear in this world, or that polish, like it doesn't need to go away, right? Like if you want to change the world or change a policy, you do have to be an effective communicator, right? But I think if you take that polish to a natural extent, sometimes you could be inauthentic, to your point earlier, Arvind, to who you really are. And I think in the last 5-ish years in life is the first time that I've realized that like certain truths, like confronting them allow you to fulfill your dharma and show up for those truths, but they also kind of add a different amount of color and sheen to you, right? It's not the same old polish that you could control. So that's why sometimes I feel like I maybe took the polish a little too far when it came to like honoring who I was in a personal life and just trading on like, well, this is how I seem to be in my professional life, so I'll sort of keep the two divided. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I love that you're talking about this, because I've viscerally felt this transition in our lives where even starting this podcast is one of the things, right? It's like there's a spectrum between like what's perception versus what's the most authentic ground truth. And I think we're in a world where the currency used to be the perception 100%. And we're moving to a world where it's becoming more and more important to be authentic. And actually, the authenticity is the new currency, right? Like people that are being elevated by society are the ones who are most authentically expressing themselves in a way. Versus in the past, it was very much like, oh, like, do they look the part?
Yeah.
Do they sound the part?
Yeah.
And I think that's changed. That's a seat change in how people operate and people think of things today.
That's true. That's a very good point. I mean, you see that kind of on display in populist electoral outcomes, right? Like certainly Trump seems, I'm sure there's a ton of politicking and positioning in his mind in the way his synapses fire, but presents as true to form, right? And like giving minimal Fs to be able to like cultivate a groundswell of support. And then also in other parts of the world, right? Like with Brexit related politics, sort of the new Conservative Party coming to rise in Canada. I agree with that. That's part of, this is a bit of a tangent, but that's part of the reason why I find some modern frustration with climate, because and Arvind, I mean, I'm gonna tag you as a subject matter expert in this space, given all of your work in sustainability and like vertical farming, and I'm sure countless other experiences that I'm not aware of. But the authenticity piece seems to be like, as Vivek said, like we can just be a little bit more direct and a little bit more clear-eyed. I think for quite some time, climate change and like how we respond to it has been a little bit of a distant truth, right? Like you had Gore putting out there an inconvenient truth very long ago, or what felt long ago. And then you had politicians who got the opportunity to say, by 2050, we will achieve X, right? We'll be net zero. We'll hit our warming goals, which tends to mean manage our warming to 1.5 degrees. But now we're about 15, 20 years out of like the rubber truly meeting the road. And actually the rubber's already meeting it, right? With extreme weather events, what we're tragically witnessing down in Southern California. And in parts of the world that you and I don't step foot in every day, there's like constant impacts of the changing environment. And the fact that that is not a predicate enough for action, and the fact that like if you even talk honestly about these things and truthfully, you don't get the actual response for action, is sort of the inverse, Vivek, of what you're saying, which is like I hear your point. We have more authenticity and kind of like being true to form, and almost in a way not necessarily caring about like the being polished as before seems to work politically. But when it comes to just kind of yelling and saying, what the hell are we doing here, people, to push action, that still seems to like butt up against like real politics, which frustrates me.
Yeah, can I reflect on that for this election cycle? Because one of the things that actually really frustrated me personally, being someone who's been in climate or sustainability for a while, was the way that Kamala approached talking about climate in her debate answers and her responses. I think that the feedback that she likely received was, make it about the economy, make it about manufacturing jobs, and I remember in one of the debates, she got a question about climate change. It was one of the last questions she answered first. And she basically said, we've put in place a robust climate agenda that is helping the manufacturing sector.
Yeah.
And that was the focus of the answer. It wasn't about the impacts of climate change. It wasn't about climate change being real and how we need to address it globally. And what that did for me, which I don't know how you kind of, manage this, but it made it feel like Trump then got to respond in a way that was purely also manufacturing based. He didn't have to address anything about climate change. He basically said, these guys have screwed up manufacturing. They're talking about increasing manufacturing, but look, it's a manufacturing question. And so it allows the conversation to just shift completely to the economy.
Yeah.
Rather than, to me, confronting the science and understanding the science is important, and understanding, because fundamentally you elect someone into office to make decisions that you can't foresee what they're going to have to decide on, right? There's going to be something 2 or 3 years down the line that's going to come to their desk, maybe as an emergency, maybe as a bill, that you want to know foundationally what they believe so that you can think about how they're going to act on future situations. You can't predict all of the specific policy. So to me, there was a little bit of almost inauthenticity there where the Democrats, I think, became scared of voicing this public belief that we need to act on the climate. And the dance has been interesting. Like, I think personally, and you could probably speak to this a little more clearly, but I think Obama did a very good job of being sort of nerdy, deep in the facts, and also feeling really, really authentic. And I think that, maybe you can tell us a little about your role in all of that and how you all worked on that. But he was able to navigate that line and also be really honest with people about things like climate change and be direct. Somehow we've lost the messenger that can do both of those things. And so in the Democratic Party, it feels like to me the authenticity has shifted towards focus group based messaging that just this polled well, let me message it. Even though I would love for someone to come across the way you just described and be authentic about the reality so that we can kind of gain a basic consensus rather than just, hey, oh, look over here, it's a manufacturing thing. No, look over here, it's a jobs thing. It's like, no, it's a real climate problem that it's affecting a lot of other things.
And
too.
I think maybe even this is the separate point, but
yeah,
I think we need a PR change on how we talk about climate. It's like, do we really want to keep on bringing up the same tropes of climate change and global warming, or do you want to just shift the entire conversation to extreme weather events or something that more viscerally, impacts people who are experiencing this or seeing all the, the images and what you see, the footage speaks for itself. Like you don't need to talk a lot about the science or whatever if you have some way to connect the extreme weather events and crazy things that are happening on the ground with a broader problem that we need to solve.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very good point on the first point on like the general messenger and like the approach to things. I do feel, clearly that the Democratic Party, it's not a monolith in every county Democratic Party to state Democratic Party to the national DNC, but like just to assume that it's just one entity so far, I think has a huge like postmortem to like sift through, right? Both in terms of message, both in terms of what did we miss, right? And that's why I thought that AOC framework was like so thoughtful, because it was like, if you voted for me, and in like the polling data also overlaps with voting for Trump, like that in polling terms, what they call the crosstabs of like who that person is, what's the profile of those types of voters.
I think okay. So I didn't vote for Trump, but I think that person is more and more becoming me. Like I'm becoming more and more that person, where I feel like a lot of the underlying values of the Democratic Party I do believe in, and a lot of the a lot of the basic fundamental decency, those kind of things I really believe in. On the other hand, though, like I feel that I also feel that there's just a lot of Arvind and I talked about this in one of our first podcasts, which is the Democrats feel a need to like defend every government policy because Trump and the Republicans are attacking and saying, "Hey, we need to make things
government."
Yeah. And whereas like I think you can do both at the same time, where you're like, okay, yeah, our government, it doesn't work like for a lot of things. Like I think that's a fundamental ground truth that there's an inability to acknowledge that.
Yeah.
On the left.
I mean, and then also, well, there's two thoughts there, like one on the message and then one on like the government efficiency. On the message side, like this is, I think, the concern with Arvin's point on the messenger, because take a look at the average Democratic voter, right? And this is not a true average, but California, we had retail safety and like enforcement for criminal activity on the ballot, and a lot of people who voted for Kamala Harris or Democrats elsewhere on the ticket voted yes on strengthening crime provisions, right? And typically the tough on crime frame gets to be pulled as like the territory of the right, suggesting that like Democrats in California might be moving a little bit more to the right on crime and safety. The second example, women who voted for abortion rights and protecting choice in multiple ballot referenda across the country, but still voted for Trump. I think the Democratic Party made a bet, and I remember that colleagues that I had at the ACLU when I was there also made a bet that if you put reproductive rights on the ballot, that will drive Democratic turnout, which means that you'll both get to protect the reproductive right lost in the Supreme Court, and you'll push the Democrat up. But in this election, people just split their votes, right? Which again, like in the crime example, they split their votes. And then finally, like another example, which hits close to all of our origin stories as kids of immigrants, is that you'll have a lot of first generation immigrant children and or minority groups vote for Trump, which seemingly votes against their own interest, one could argue. And that's another sort of split in attitude. So these splits are sort of reflecting, I think, either a change in the way the country's thinking about things, or maybe they're very issue specific. Either way, you need a shit ton of nuance to be able to be an effective messenger that can parse those things out. Right. And one thing I noticed, I had a very
but I think my argument would be like, maybe you don't need a lot of nuance. Maybe you just like be really authentic about it. And that's kind of what's selling now,
But I don't know if you were going to get into this, but like, what did Obama, like, to me, I think it's a baseline that Obama was a really good, very good at being both authentic and honest about some of these things.
Mm-hmm.
And have you thought about the differentiation? What was he doing differently than what you've seen in more recent Democratic elections that made that resonate?
I think, well, there's a couple of things, right? One, there was a patience and like, I think there was a patience in the American electorate to watch and truly observe what a president was doing at that time, because it was such a historic election, right? It was the first Black president, as we know, but when that comes, I think the patience for the more professorial, the more thoughtful way in which he would answer was appreciated by the country. I think people wanted to see, what did he stand for? What kind of president would he be? Would be a president to just Black America or to white America, or how would that kind of bridge? And I think there was much more of a patience, in addition to people being intrigued by what he might stand for, by the mere fact that our information economy is also drastically different today versus then, right? He was, I think, one of the first campaigns notably to use digital means and used, social media like Facebook, or then called Facebook, among most presidential tickets. But then now you have, like, as you know, a litany of mediums in which that you can like target information, which means that people's patience and I think headspace has shrunk. So they kind of want to know, just like, what are you doing for my pocketbook? What are you doing for my basic needs? What are you doing for my housing? What are you doing for my safety? And I think that means that the patience, in my opinion, has kind of come down a little bit. I do think a different piece of this is, how do you message, and like, how do you get an effective messenger? Vivek's point is on just be direct about what you can do and what you can't do. I feel I am, to your point earlier, Arvind, about polish, I am a little bit of an institutionalist. I think when your first job out of college is in Congress, you naturally kind of feel like everyone should carry a briefcase and wear a tie and say their polished talking points. So this has that color. But I do think that a messenger that's able to effectively keep the party big tent a place for the poor, for immigrants, for those that have climate anxiety, for parents, for single mothers, for the LGBTQ community. I still believe the party should be that big tent. But I think the biggest reflection for me after this last election is how much the pocketbook issues matter, right? And like how much people just want to know how the basic needs of their communities are being addressed. And like, I've talked to so many Democrats in San Francisco and New York, and for work, and I can get into this, I've increasingly been spending time in the South, including Houston and different pockets of Louisiana. And you hear a lot of people say, hey, I got a kid who's in high school. They're talking to me about climate change. I work in the oil and gas industry. I just really want to make sure that my job's not going away so I can pay for college. It's not that I don't believe in it, right? They're talking to me about it. And when you hear it just framed in such simple terms like that, or closer to where we live, people want to just know that they can walk to school safely, and there's not like the concern of drugs or violence kind of appearing in their life, like a lot of the AAPI community confronted during the COVID years in the Bay Area, in Oakland and San Francisco, for example. And I think that you can still keep the nuance. You can still keep a party that is looking out for you're tired, you're hungry, you're poor. But we have to just get at this. How does the party stand for basic needs? And the Republican Party is very good at just talking about, you want economic security, you want energy security, you want freedom from government intervention, and you want to make sure that you've got a healthy retirement and a good paying job. Then like, we're the party for
But
you. And I don't
but
think that's ground we have to see. I think that we
yeah.
can talk about the economy in a way that works better for workers by having stronger, like good paying jobs through union protections. I think we could talk about housing security by forcing governors to build and hit their housing targets. And I think we can talk about climate change in the forms of like energy security, because based off of all that Inflation Reduction Act and infrastructure law money, it is creating jobs. I hear your point on it ceding ground as to where the debate is, but I think if we're able to toe a line of, here is how we're going to invest in your economic mobility at a time where Gen Z, Gen Alpha, maybe in a few years, and then millennials are feeling like that part of the stability, that part of the American story is distraught, that basic compact that you work hard, you earn a little bit, and then you leave your kids off a little better than you came about. That part is shaken, and we do need to recenter our focus on those economic terms.
Yeah. I mean, maybe I'm going to tee you up to disagree with what I said earlier, because I think that, there's probably a part of me that's worked in climate for a long time that just fundamentally believes that climate change is happening.
Yeah.
Like Vivek said, maybe it's more messaged as extreme weather events are happening more and more frequently, and that, we have to do something about it. I think the framework, you're running a policy division now that sort of requires you to convince people at some level and form a groundswell of support to support money going into climate prevention in the form of taking carbon out of the air. To me, the pocketbook issues that we might focus on day to day sort of lend themselves towards climate keeps getting put in the back. It's like, okay, we have to focus on the front issue. So that's one thing, is just how are you currently navigating if you're focused on daily pocketbook issues, it feels just like the climate issue just keeps getting bumped to the back, including, hey, drill baby drill, like let's just drill more oil to make everything cheaper so that pocketbook goes down. So that's first question. Second question is sort of like, if the framing around climate change, as you say, actually correctly should be around jobs and around economic prosperity. To me, maybe the missing piece is that there needs to be a sort of link drawn between how current practices are going to affect the job and the pocketbook in a negative way. And I feel like there's a lot of messaging that happens around, hey, we're building a battery plant, we're building an electric car plant, but a lot of people view that as a trade-off against jobs that are currently existing in gas, oil and gas, and in current. But I would love for some sort of framing to come out where it's like, the current policies are going to see this type of economic decline without a correction. You're going to see coastal communities affected. You're going to see a lot of jobs affected. So we have to do this to improve everyone's life, not just in the long term, but in the short term. And here's why: you can't maintain current trajectory. So sorry, I'm not sure those two can be taken together or not, but those are two things that came to.
They can.
Yeah.
And also, I'm just mindful before I dive into that, Vivek, is this directionally what you want? I realize all of our tones got a little bit more professional than when we were talking about Arjun's.
I love this. This is the show, dude. This is the show.
Okay, word. I grapple with this a lot. So just taking a step back, in my day job, I run policy for a company called Heirloom. The UN issued a report, Arvind, as you're very well aware of, in 2018, saying that in order to hit our climate goals, we need to manage our warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And there's two ways to do that. You need to reduce emissions, diversify off fossil fuels, and then you need to remove existing emissions. Reductions in emissions, removals of emissions. So Heirloom was sort of born out of that second category. We're able to, through a patented technology, pull carbon dioxide out of the air and permanently take it out, so that way we can get to net zero. This is for audiences that might be listening in here, carbon dioxide. This is different than carbon capture. Carbon capture is a technology that, if you're drilling for oil or you're running an ethanol plant, you're a traditional oil employer, let's just say Exxon or Occidental Petroleum, when you do that process, there's some emissions. And carbon capture is putting a scrubber at that oil refinery at the point source of that emission, and just blunting the total amount of CO2 that comes out. So that is, I'm going to pollute for my process and give people, gas at the pump, but I'm going to try and mitigate a little bit how much CO2 is coming out. That is very different than what we're doing. What we're doing is saying there's already a ton of CO2 in the air, methane in the air. How do we remove that? Not 2 steps forward, 1 steps back by drilling a bit, containing the CO2, and then turning around on TV and marketing it as a low carbon gas, but actually pulling down existing pollutants in the air. So that is a tough marketing exercise to distinguish. But the reason I mention that, a very wonky aspect of what we're working on, is that a lot of oil companies care about the carbon capture side. A lot of new climate companies that have been, venture backed and Silicon Valley funded care about this removal side. And I've noticed that the way that you talk about these technologies do have to change in different communities, right? When we talk to Governor Newsom's team in California, or California lawmakers, of which 32 new legislators have been elected, I think around 30 into Sacramento, you would think that you can talk about these in very authentic terms, right? Look what happened in LA. If we have more heat captured in the air, it will only drive extreme weather events. Let's do something about that. But what you run into there is a very real challenge where no one really knows who Heirloom is, right? Like, we've spent a ton of time educating folks, bringing people out to our facilities. So we are educating and advancing a ball here, but no one really knows who we are, but they know who the oil and gas companies are. And the oil and gas companies are very good at investing in those new lawmakers that ascend to office, supporting their campaigns. And I don't want to make it seem like it's all pay to play, but if you have alignment between oil refineries and everyone at that refinery is employed by a union, and unions are very powerful in California, and they support the political outcomes of these races. Even if I say, bro, did you see what Lawrence Livermore National Lab says? They're pretty much connecting the dots between CO2 in the air and that trapping heat and that resulting in extreme events. We should do something about that, right? And like the intellectual conclusion is, yes, we should. But should we do it against the backdrop of these Herculean forces of political incumbent industries is difficult to pull off in California. On top of that, the second thing I will say is that in California, post-Trump, a lot of people are nervous in a political level about affordability issues. Anything, whether it's new forms of renewable energy, green hydrogen, direct air capture, like what we do at Heirloom, or any new policies that are good for the kind of liberal agenda that could increase the cost of anything: eggs at the grocery store, gas at the pump. Affordability, the state is very sensitive to. So even in very liberal California, you have these two headwinds where there's an incumbent industry, they're very good at playing politics, and there's a concern about anything that you invest in that would increase the cost of anything. And that makes it really, really hard to pull off these things in California. And the reason I wanted to share that super long-winded windup is that we have to, as a messenger, meet people where they are. And so I think we need to talk about it in terms of, if you do not make these investments now, these horrible, horrible events will continue. That will increase the cost of living, decrease the amount of insurance, and just make it really hard for your job and your income to actually cover your basic needs. And I think that that is something that we are working on right now, sort of shifting that narrative. But it is something that you would not think that you need to do in California. And I'll say one last thing about just being authentic about the communications in Louisiana. I mentioned where we actually won Biden money from the infrastructure law to build, and we're building in Speaker Mike Johnson's district. It's a part of Louisiana called Shreveport. There's two parishes there. Parish is sort of like a municipality within a city. One's called Caddo, one called Bossier. When we build there, we talk about all of this in terms of jobs and wages and investments. And that's important to meet them where they are at, because they very much care about, if the oil industry is on the decline, what are you going to do to augment those jobs? If you're showing up in my town and you're promising all this new investment, are you sure that it's not going to result in firing my current job? Like, are you going to augment jobs, or are you going to replace jobs? And finally, if you think about how China and Japan and other countries are also investing in carbon technologies to manage their emissions outputs, as AI appetites grow and energy intensive demand also grows, then you kind of need to articulate, hey, Louisiana, the Gulf Coast, it can continue to be a leader in that community. And I think that we can continue to lead our energy security and our energy independence relative to these other nation states that are also encroaching, but only if you embrace us and only if you allow this new investment, this new job creation to exist in your state. Those are two very, very different frames, from the California context to the Louisiana context. And I think as a policy professional, sometimes I feel inauthentic speaking about the carbon removal premise or the climate change policies that we need in two different ways to two different audiences. But I'm starting to feel that, like, as Vivek mentioned earlier, you just need to be real and authentic at the top, for sure. But when it comes to putting steel in the ground, building physical things in communities, not shipping code to an app store, not to minimize that, but it's just very different. You need to have a dialogue with the community locally. What is this? What are you doing? How does it affect my well-being, my health, the air quality, the job creation? And I think that the Democratic Party on issues like climate need to meet most people where they're at. And it is important to focus on the science, but it's also important to blend that science into what does this mean for the community that you live in. And I do think that that is not ceding ground. I don't think that's flip-flopping. I don't think that's tailoring a message. I think that's the world that we live in. And if we're only going to focus on the ideological perspective of, well, we should be intellectually true to what the IPCC says, what the national labs say, we start to kind of forego what is on most people's minds. We lose the social license to build, and then we don't even get like the permits and the kind of the support to continue to grow. Sorry, I know that was a lot, but that's kind of how I view those two perspectives.
No, I think it's super needed to talk through this, and I feel the two different frames that you had and how you sort of need the communications to be specific to people and meet them where they are, like you said. I that really resonates with me. And to take maybe a quick step back, I think another thing that just the what you were just talking about made me think of is it's becoming more and more important for companies to have a way to communicate with people, and especially in industries that are regulated or impacted by regulation or butt up against state, local, federal government. And one of the things that you've had to do in your career, or have done in your career, not had to do, but you've chosen to do, is go from being someone who is in DC, walking the halls in Congress, etc., to transitioning over back home to Silicon Valley, essentially.
Yeah.
And kind of building policy teams at startups. Maybe you could reflect a little bit on that and how that change even happened, and what your thoughts are on it, and should we see more and more of this?
Yeah. I mean, when I first got to DC, to Arvin's earlier point, like I was excited to be there, right? That was sort of the polish that I was aspiring for, to be in those halls of government. As Vivek mentioned, had a brief stint working for a member of Congress, and then also had opportunity to work in the Obama administration. I actually thought that that's where you could affect the most change from the seat of government. I didn't, but for the last 5 years, I was in my time there, I was working on economic policy. And this was during the recession of 08, 09. And we started moving all of these programs that we thought was going to help manufacturing growth or startup growth. And I kind of started to feel, and actually it was Congressman Ro Khanna, who is now elected to Silicon Valley to represent us, but then was a colleague at the Department of Commerce. And he said, "Have you ever worked in the private sector? You might want to give that some thought." And I was like, "Are you kidding me, bro? I just arrived to DC. I get to say that I worked in the Obama administration. Like, why would I leave now?" But it was a very good point that I didn't appreciate until much later, which is, it's one thing to allege what's good for the economy. And for business growth, it's a totally different thing, as you guys know, as operators at different businesses, to butt up against those policies and regulations, and sort of feel the gears of slow government action or regulation kind of inhibit growth. So I sort of thought at the end of the Obama term, when Trump came in, that it would be helpful for my own sort of well-being to switch to the other side of the equation and just broaden my understanding of what the private sector side of the ledger is relative to the public sector side. And I got an opportunity to work at Postmates, which for those that haven't heard of it is like a burrito delivery app, which was acquired by Uber and became Uber Eats. And we're all familiar with those technologies. I remember my mom, Amma, was like, "What do you mean you're going from Barack Obama to burrito delivery?" And I was kind of like, "Oh snap! Yeah, like what am I doing here by building this policy shop?" So I will admit, in 2016, 2017, when I made the jump, some companies like Facebook, Airbnb, they were starting to like hit Twitter. They were hitting this growth where the product had shipped. There was stickiness in the marketplace. They had some policy challenges. They hired people to unblock and triage. And so for me at Postmates, it was a Series C or Series D company when I joined. They were starting to run into a lot of challenges around how workers were being treated. And it was the first time that I realized when Uber and Instacart and DoorDash and Postmates had to confront tough conversations with labor unions and then lawmakers who also wanted to know that the CEOs weren't making billions of dollars on the backs of low wage work, that I realized, oh, actually, from the perch of the private sector, there are lots of policy conversations to be had. And particularly when you're in a young company where they're kind of pushing and kind of begging the question of how a space should be regulated. I found that very fascinating and very interesting. And
Did you feel strongly about knowing that you supported what Postmates did, like going in before you accepted the offer and saying, I want to understand that you guys are actually treating people well and that what I'm going to be arguing for is sort of ethical? Or did you feel like that's a question that you could help to shape with Postmates, even if you felt like there was some harm, that you'd go in and you'd make it better? How did you think about that?
I think it's a super good question. And actually, I met my better half. Arvind, I don't really think that you've met her, but Vivek
Not
has, or
yet.
maybe you
Yeah.
have. Her name is Amber, my fiance.
Great person. Love
She's
her.
a great human. I'm undeserving of her, but she was actually a head of a labor union that we were tussling with.
Oh, cool.
And
Yeah.
so I would almost wonder what
Is
she would
this
say.
a new Netflix series that we're gonna see?
It can be. It can be. If these
How
YouTube
the
shorts really get traction.
It's literally Postmates. They're now mates. There you go.
That's right.
let's go, dude. We got to make that happen. We'll make T-shirts.
I don't think, if I'm being truly honest with you, Arvind, I don't think I had the foresight to understand how big the fight would be. Because eventually what happened is after I started building the team, and I very much approached it with this ethos of like, what can we do right for the workers? But then there was a Supreme Court case that impacted our landscape. And then there was a big fight in the legislature of California and in New York. And every single person running for the Democratic nomination to be president, to beat Trump, that was Harris, Pete, Liz Warren, countless others. They weighed in on this fight. They actually had a policy, and typically national figures don't weigh in on state level legislation. So I was like, wow, this is a much bigger than I could have anticipated. And I do think that it showed me that every job I had since then, if you talk about taking on a policy challenge, I think I have that foresight now to be like, okay, how are you approaching X? How are you approaching Y? But then it was the first time, just to be totally candid with you, where I think I did believe in the fact that most labor law in this country was crafted before we had these, right? And before we had iPhones and app-based work. So some change was necessary. But how you balance the business needs of hitting profits every quarter, eventually to raise your next round, to maybe get an exit, go public, or be acquired, like how you balance that with public policy, it was a huge learning for me. And I think what's changed since then, and I can dig into the ethics of this with you, but as Vivek was asking, now in 2025, it's not just the province of Series D companies with big product market fit with household brands that need policy people. It's the AI companies that might be pre-seed or A or B that are monitoring what DC might do, or what California had a big AI bill last session might do. It's the climate tech companies that almost need to hire a version of a policy director, a version of me, before their product has that stickiness in the marketplace, because they need to unlock capital or need the market for demand for climate technologies to be created. It's like the crypto companies and the fintech companies that are navigating.
Crypto is already spending a ton. I think crypto was, I think there, I don't know, I have to find a source for this, but I think crypto was the biggest, if not one of the biggest industries to donate in the last election cycle.
I think
and mostly towards towards Trump, because he was pro crypto.
I think that is a correct fact. Yeah.
Is that a new thing, Vikram? Like when you started at Postmates, was having a policy team a normal thing for smaller companies?
No.
And knowing that so it was actually, even for Postmates, did they understand the value of what you were going to be doing, or was it kind of like, let's just figure out, it feels like we need someone to be talking to the channels of government?
Our CEO Bastian, I think, had the foresight to know that this challenge was looming. But I do think a lot of it was, if you're hiring someone that early on, and this is the beauty of coming in and doing policy at a much earlier company's stage of policy rather than much later, because you can kind of build it with the sort of fingerprints that you want on it, right? And so I think that he knew we needed it for various challenges that tax conversations we were having, labor conversations that we were having. Postmates was also toying with a autonomous delivery device, and so there were sort of local regulations around like running these devices around town. So he knew we needed it, but I don't think any of us observed that the fight would be that big on that side. And ultimately, using public policy, we were able to position the company in a way that was very attractive for an acquisition. So while some, including maybe my partner, might argue that you're using policy for corporate ends, I do think that it was the larger companies that have these challenges that felt that they needed to invest in it. And at that time, per Vivek's point on crypto investments in this 2024 election cycle, the money we had spent on a ballot measure called Prop 22 around gig economy workers represented, I believe, the largest investment by private companies in the United States on a ballot measure for any tech policy challenge. That number has been blunted, and now crypto sort of takes the reins as the largest spender on an election cycle in terms of candidates themselves, right? Now, not every company, especially like younger startups or even younger funds that have portcos, are going to be able to put in-house people to do kind of what I do at Heirloom or what I did at Postmates or what people do at Uber, et cetera. But I do think that it represents a tectonic shift, right? Governments are way more willing to examine a new growth sector and introduce bills. They may not pass them. Congress is still pretty slow, but introducing bills creates either some amount of certainty for the market or uncertainty, depending on how you look at it, which means I think VCs and boards at companies want to know, how are you going to grapple with this? And then not to mention what we're seeing right now, we're one day before Inauguration Day, and there's shit tons of coverage detailing how many tech CEOs are flying out and spending time with this president-elect and soon-to-be president. And so it's sort of suggesting that there is a sea change where not only do sectors need to hire policy people earlier and earlier on, but because government is becoming so blunt and authentic in sort of its prowess and how it's going to exert itself on people, it's now demanding that CEOs, VCs spend time with this new presidency. So how you invest in that, I think, is really, really, really important. And it's a conversation that I think startups need to be having in the same way that they would talk, put a slide in their deck about what's our ROI in Q4 next year. They need to name how they're going to navigate some of these challenges earlier and earlier on.
Yeah, I mean, I can just, for me, I'm working in outdoor farming now. We're trying to convert, cow manure into useful protein for livestock. And one thing I'm finding is regulators have an incentive, I think, to be inertial in some way. Like they have a disincentive to allow new things, and they have an incentive to protect the downside risk. And so as a new technology in any field, I think speaking to a regulator in a way where they understand that this is something that could be net positive either for the community or the climate, that the upsides are worth whatever the implied just risk of some new approval is a really interesting way to think about it. And I mean, you're kind of framing that same conversation in that, any new technology comes to the desk of someone in the government and they're thinking, man, why should I approve this? The risk that something goes wrong is just incredibly high. Yeah. So I'm finding even we need to be thinking about in our company, and it's very small, but we need to be thinking in the same way you're articulating. And it's not something we've even, like this conversation is even elucidating it for me clearly, which is we haven't been focused on that in the same way that we might be if we had a team that was dedicated to looking forward on policy. We sort of approach it when we run into a roadblock in the policy realm. Let's get over it. It's sort of because we're so small that I don't think we've dedicated the resources to it. But I could see that being massively beneficial to thinking about the forward look there.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I'm
and I
curious
know we're
about like
running.
how you think about that, just given the size of companies you've been at.
Yeah, I mean, I think like tech companies in general, I think that they have been investing in policy folks for many years now, and because it's needed. And I remember seeing like Google and Facebook doing this, and them going up in front of Congress a few years back, and everything like that. And it's like it's obvious the need for it, and especially if you're in a regulated space,
Yeah,
you know, fintech in particular, one that comes to mind from my background. But you sort of need those folks early and often.
you do. You do.
So
Yeah.
I know we're running up on time here, but sort of last question, if you're okay with it, for just to spend a couple minutes on before
And
we
and I put
part
in
ways.
the
And look,
chat, by the way, I
yeah,
don't know if you saw it, but I can
oh yeah,
go a little longer if that's
okay, perfect. Yeah, we can go a little longer. It feels like we need to have another chat in a few months or something,
yeah.
for sure. So, but last quick one for you is, like you said, we've got a new new set of folks in town in DC, about to take the reins tomorrow, especially as it relates to climate policy, since you've that's your area and domain right now. Um, what predictions do you have? Like, what do you think is going to happen in that realm in the next few years?
I one thing I just want to observe, and I don't know if you feel this way, but for the first time in my life, this election cycle had children in my life, and it was the first time I had to have a conversation with them about the outcomes. And from the election night, it was almost like a feeling of, you know, this is who we still are as a people, and we need to be able to like connect with those that we might disagree with and understand where they're coming from. And then 2 days later, we had a company town hall about how we at Heirloom, as a player in the climate space, are going to navigate changes that might be afoot when it comes to two flagship pieces of legislation signed by Biden, the IRA and the infrastructure law. Um, and so the reason I mentioned this is like going into go mode with young people that you're talking to, or with your colleagues at work, about how you're going to navigate this to, next week, actually this week, election week, or sorry, inauguration week, I'm going to be in DC, meeting with House and Senate Republicans around some of these climate challenges and how to protect them. I feel like I'm much more in go mode, and as opposed to 2016, when I was still working in government, and I felt like there was like a 4 month, if not 4 year hangover, right? Like where there was this deep malaise, this deep anxiety in navigating it all. And I mentioned that contrast. Maybe I'm in a different place in life. Maybe I'm slightly more removed from government, but I think the response to his arrival can be very concerning if you're a women's rights group or an immigration advocacy group. So I don't want to make light of these challenges, but I do think that there's this headspace shift within the private sector, certainly within the tech community, of, all right, we got another 4 years of this dude. How do we work with it? Instead of how do we fight it, how do we work with it? And I think that that's going to be very interesting for us to monitor, because it might suggest, unlike the first term, where every few weeks there was a CEO missive, Tim Cook poo-pooing the fact that Trump is withdrawing from the Paris Climate Accords in 2017, 2018, or the CEO of Uber weighing in on how it was bad for Trump to issue the Muslim ban. I think we're not going to see as much of that this time around. We may see some of it, but I think what we're going to see is CEOs figuring out how do you stitch together public-private partnerships to move the ball forward on sectors that are just like a vote away from new regulations. That's sort of prediction number one. Prediction two, for those listening to these audience on this podcast, in this audience, that are nervous about what might come. I don't want to pretend that I know the man or can predict the man, but I think it's really important for all of us to watch what he does, not what he says. There's a lot of bluster in the party, and part of this kind of goes, Vivek, to your earlier point about being authentic and just being Rogan about it, right? Just like chopping it up, speaking your truth, saying shit, seeing where it sticks. But then there's a difference between how those map in a White House context to executive orders, budget proposals, legislation on Capitol Hill. And I think that we are going to need to honor that mantra to feel a little bit at ease and not feel the anxiety day to day of what's going to happen. So that was the second thing I just wanted to note. And then the third thing to your question on climate is the Inflation Reduction Act and the infrastructure law, two pieces of legislation that have unlocked tons of money, the kind of money that Arvind referenced was being spoken about by Kamala Harris on the campaign trail for investing in manufacturing jobs in the United States, green manufacturing jobs at that. A lot of that cash is flowing to red states. I know Heirloom is an example of a company that's building in Louisiana. There are other companies building in places like Wisconsin, or sorry, Wyoming, Texas, Colorado, which is more of a purple state. But I think that what this means is that we have an obligation as messengers for these companies and in policy leads for these companies to articulate what we were talking about earlier, which is how do these investments maintain energy dominance for the United States, maintain energy security and inoculate any gains in the same technology that China wants to make, and also maintains a little bit of economic activity in this country. And I think that we have a fighting chance to protect certain provisions of those acts if we're able to connect the dots in that way. You know, carbon removal, I mentioned, for those who have stuck with my very verbose conversation with you guys today and are still listening to this pod, you guys might remember a few moments ago, we talked about carbon capture versus carbon removal. There are certain provisions of the Inflation Reduction Act that are tax credits that actually give opportunities and funding to both. So where you can find crossover allegiances, unlikely alliances of climate companies like Heirloom working with energy majors like BP or Occidental Petroleum, that's going to be an area of an overlap where you can safeguard a piece of the IRA. It might feel sticky, it might feel ugly, it might feel disingenuous or intellectually inconsistent and dishonest to your true self, but that's what we're going to have to do to preserve climate investments, which is meet people and lawmakers where they're at, find unlikely fellowship with other industries that also care about it. And I think we'll see the IRA being poked into a form of Swiss cheese where things like electric vehicle credits may be falling off, but protections and for carbon removal may be staying in. I don't want to take any of this for granted, but I do think we have a fighting chance to maintaining some of this, but it is going to be important how we show up, how we talk about it, and how we think about these investments as more of energy security investments rather than climate change investments.
That's super insightful. Thanks so much for sharing. And yeah, since you have a little bit more time, maybe something also topical, but maybe taking off your climate policy hat and putting on your all other policy hat. What's your take on the TikTok ban? What Trump has been saying the last year? I don't know if you've been following this.
I have.
What do you think is gonna happen there? It's kind of crazy nuts,
Dude,
right?
this is, I gotta be honest. This, we were talking about earlier, Democrats and messengers. This is one of those areas that makes me hella nervous because I want to believe, to go back to a thread way earlier in the conversation, that Secretary Buttigieg, Mayor Pete, the governor of Maryland, Wes Moore, the governor of Michigan, Gretchen Whitmer. There's a lot, and countless others I'm probably not naming. There's a lot. Gavin Newsom, California's governor, which I know he's going through a tough time, as are the people of LA right now. But there's a lot of talent in the Democratic Party that I think can beat back, rebuild, and regain footing in the country because they're very good messengers, in my opinion. But I opened TikTok yesterday to see it and see what had happened or what if it would really been shut down. And I saw the worst message of all time, which was not only is TikTok on hold right now or shutting our operations, but the second sentence in that screenshot, we are pleased that Donald Trump will be working with us on a solution. I forgot their exact word choice. I think Vivek's pulling it up. That to me was a crushing blow because it suggests that he's already signaled that he wants to try and fix this, and he likes it because there's so many Trump supporters for him. There it is. We are fortunate that President Trump has indicated he will work with us on a solution. I'm nervous that we've already lost ground as a party this last election cycle, as Arvind pointed out. And now we're going to have a generation of young people, myself included, that are going to see this man fixing a tech that this modern livelihood is based on for millions of humans.
But man, Trump just knows he knows how to feel the political winds, and he is intuitive about it. You know, I feel like if the Democrats had won, there would have been like 6 council meetings about this and like a lot of public polling, and then it would have been some like kind of fumbled response. He's just like, I'm the only messenger that matters. I'm the only decision maker that matters. It feels like he can just decide and be like, and you know what's funny is I don't even know if he has the power to do what he's saying. It's just that he says it. And now it's like, okay, we're not going to prosecute anyone for 90 days. We're not going to enforce any of this. It's like he may not even have that kind of, but he just knows that from a messaging perspective, it's a pure win.
We're going to have to add this in post, but if you all think back to the origins of this, Trump was rallying against TikTok.
He was.
He was rallying against TikTok and saying that he has kind of an anti-China stance, or had, which is very much changing in the last 2 weeks. Which is, it's just fascinating how he plays politics, being considered the outsider from back in the day of not being a political insider. I mean, he's had 4 years as a president now, and he's really good at playing politics.
He is, and I think this is probably one of the most challenging things that I feel, as to Arvin's first question about polish, right? There used to be an era. I mean, I used to watch with my uppa a Sunday news show on NBC called Meet the Press.
Yeah.
I would read my
Stephanopoulos, right?
It was
or no.
No. Shoot, it was, what was his name? I need to know this. The host of Meet the Press was, what's his name?
We'll find it. Chuck Todd? No. Tom Brokaw?
No, go back.
Tim Russert?
Tim Russert. Like a true
he was one of those Me Too people. He got Me Too canceled. Tim Russert.
No, I don't think he did. I think he passed away from an ailment, actually.
Oh, okay. Maybe I'm thinking of someone else. Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry, Tim
Vic
Russert.
just libeling people out.
Oh no.
I think it was a heart condition or a heart attack.
Oh man, sorry.
No. It's okay, dude. Let's.
We'll cut it out. We'll edit it in post. No problem.
Just pour one out for Tim Russert. But the point I was trying to make is, like, in this era, politicians would show up with polish, state what their priorities for the week are, and kind of focus on them, and the world would go ballistic if they changed their position. Right.
Yeah.
And that's
like
kind of
Mitt Romney. Mitt Romney was known as, he flip-flopped on healthcare because he did the healthcare, and it was like a huge deal, and people actually cared.
Huge deal, and people cared, right? And like campaigns would like bring massive amounts of resources to give oxygen to that argument. Or even when Obama was president, he had not shifted on marriage equality for the gay community or the LGBTQ community, and Biden got out in front of him and said something in a sit down news interview when people actually would tune into those things on network news, and said something, and then Obama caught up. It was sort of a flub of a news cycle for the VP to lead and the president to follow. But then Obama's position was, I've evolved on this, or he used that word, I've evolved. And I'm sure he truly believed it. But to Arvin's point about like polls, who knew what it was saying back then at that time? I guess my point is, because Trump had such an anti-TikTok stance, it was deemed during his first term a risk to national security. And now it propelled him in large swaths with a younger demo for this past election cycle. Now he's a homie. Now he's a fan. The law has been passed. So technically the executive branch, Arvin, to your point, the executive branch can decide to enforce that law or not enforce that law. I think it's pretty foolish for him to have supported a framework and then like want to undo that framework. But the Meet the Press question back from the early 90s to the early 2000s, it wouldn't result in a flip-flop. It wouldn't require him to say, I'm evolving on this issue anymore, because now people can take positions that they want and just defend the position of the day.
But it seems like he can do that, weirdly. Like, it's not everyone that can do that. He's somehow this unique, like, Kamala got all of this flack for doing that in this same cycle.
I think one of the reasons that he can do it is that he just puts out so much unfiltered, uncurated content every single day and states his position every single day that you'd have to have a research grant and a PhD to figure out what his actual position is. And so, like, he doesn't really have a position, and therefore he can say what he says today, and that's what's gold. That's what's going to go forward.
That's true. That's true. I mean, I think two insights there from my end, or two reactions, are like, one, the polish of needing to hold a intellectually consistent position seems to be begged, we beg the question on that because the channels that you have, the multitude of things you could say, like there's no way to really monitor the through line. Democrats will hold ourselves up to one another and say like that's intellectually inconsistent with what you said in the past, but I do think that like that's just something we're going to have to contend with when it comes to opponents or others in the opposition. And the second thing is, this is why for Trump, because as Vivek said, you have to like monitor what the latest gold is of the day. We have to watch what he does, not necessarily what he says, in order to make sure like how do you craft a plan to kind of counter that with policy or regulation, if that's your general position. But it is an ultimate doozy, and maybe he is just like this, Arvind, but I want to believe in the form of an America that can, on the merits of him being wrong or of a politician being wrong, we can still engage in that kind of debate. That is sort of the style of professorial intellectual debate that kind of prompted my own interest in these pathways. But if we can't do that, and we can't hold space for just like true conversations on the merits of what we're advocating for, then I hope somewhere within the deep recesses of the Democratic Party, whether it's school board or PTA or state lawmakers or mayors or governors, or existing politicians in Congress, that there's someone who can smack him back. And I think that's why companies, whether you're a startup who can afford it or you're just a parent in a community, it's why we have to now start paying hella attention always to how community and public-based policies are just affecting our world. Because if we don't, we won't cultivate that kind of talent that can rise up and counter these dynamics. Trump will go one day if we have 4 years of him, but his brand may be enshrined within like the inner bowels of the RNC.
Oh yeah, I can totally see Ivanka running. I can totally see that. I can see DJ TJ making a run at the governorship.
DJ TJ, yeah.
I mean, it's gonna happen. Like, just don't mark my words. And also, the other thing I'll say is, the big question mark for me is, can he bring taco prices down from $3 to 69 cents like they used to? Right? Like,
yes,
that's the referendum that we had in November. And I don't know that he has I don't know that he has the ability to do that.
Is that a Taco Bell commentary or any taqueria commentary?
Taco Bell. That's the tacos that most Americans are eating nowadays.
Can I say something about Taco Bell?
It wouldn't be a conversation with Vikram if we didn't say something about Taco Bell.
There are a lot of Democrats who don't love the policies of Taco Bell. They're a franchise. They don't necessarily like pay in terms of like social safety net benefits of like healthcare and retirement. Like I'm going to park all that stuff aside for a second, and like I'm sure there's a valid debate to be had there. This is one company that has used the same 7 ingredients and continuously ships new product every quarter, dude. They're like, oh, we'll add a Cheez-It to it. We'll add a Dorito to it. And it is just, it's amazing. It is the most innovative company.
Well, no, Yum Brands just owns all those. Yum Brands owns Doritos.
That's right.
They own Cheez-It or whatever, like all that shit. So that's just
what you're saying though is it's a platform play. They've formed a platform, extremely effective to just add different combinations in there. It's amazing. You got to respect it.
It's vertical integration at its finest.
Dude, Yum Brands every year in Washington, D.C. holds a reception on Capitol Hill. I don't know if I ever told you this.
You should tell the pod listeners, because this is awesome.
It has an open bar of beer and wine, but no one is there for the booze. It is a endless buffet in something called the Rayburn House Office Building, which is just a staff building where a lot of people who work for Congress work for the U.S. House of Representatives, and it is endless banquet hallway size platters of tacos, burritos. It is absolute gold. It is a lobbying campaign by Yum Brands to make sure that whatever efforts that they have in front of Capitol Hill can kowtow to their needs, but it is a damn good one. Also, did you know that Taco Bell has chicken nuggets?
Really?
No.
They just shipped them out. I know there's a lot of vegetarian listeners to this pod, so I don't want to offend anyone's senses, but I was trying to find some to like do a chicken nugget taste test with the fam on Friday, and I went to 3 different Taco Bell locations in Serramonte, Daly City. They were all sold out.
They can't pop the chickens out fast enough
They
for
can't. They
for the
can't.
consumers.
They can't.
Also, I should mention, if we can find it, we'll add it in post production. But there's a picture. You know, I couldn't attend this year, but Vikram hosts a small group of people every year for his birthday. And Vikram, you channeled your inner Yum Brands, you know, Congress situation, and had Taco Bell at your birthday. Because I mean, let's let the record show. Vikram is Taco Bell's biggest fan. Is his big, like, probably single biggest consumer in the country.
So Taco Bell policy team, if you're hiring to someone to lead the team,
that would be awesome. And also, I think their headquarters are in Irvine, and that's where they do that's where they have their R&D kitchen. I would, if anyone's listening that has a connect, really good to be with you guys.
This has been really
great. Yeah.
Thanks so much for, we're sort of taking a flyer on us. We're doing this new thing, flying by the seat of our pants. And it's so awesome to talk to people like you who you're so plugged into the policy side of things that, you know, we'd love to have you on multiple times, you know, and talk more. I think we could easily do another hour if we all had time for it. So,
thanks.
It's been awesome to hear your perspective.
Thanks for doing this. This is super fun. Yeah, keep me posted. And if you do the conversation with some of the other homies that we talked about earlier, I would love to be on a fly on the wall for that conversation. That would be amazing. You will be. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, thanks, man. This was great. Really fun to talk to you.